October 11th, 2019. Beirut. Riyad Salameh, governor of Bank Lebanon, knows the peg is finished. He has known for months. The pound will not survive. His institution will not survive. What he does next is not in the official record. What his depositors do not do, because they do not know, will cost them 98% of everything they saved. This is not speculation. This was Lebanon 2019. Here is what blows people's minds. Collapses do not begin when you are told. They begin when the people inside the system stop behaving as if the official story is true. And in Lebanon, the public story was still stability. The peg still existed. The banks were still open. The words were still calm. But the forensic record shows a system already starving for dollars. In its 2019 Article 4, the IMF wrote that deposit inflows had slowed during the previous year, reducing the authorities' room for maneuver, and urged Bank du Liban to rebuild its own financial strength and step back from quasi-fiscal operations. That was public. October 17 made it visible, so the question is not whether the warning existed. It did. The question is, who could read it? And who could act on it before the door narrowed? Because once the protest began, Lebanese banks imposed informal controls that were never properly legislated. Transfers abroad froze for most people. Dollar deposits became something stranger than money, a claim without access. Later reporting and World Bank analysis described de facto haircuts, lirification, and a collapse that locked depositors out while the pound lost more than 98% of its value. And this was not abstract. Dana Trometer, a filmmaker living in Britain, spent years trying to access her mother's trapped retirement savings in Lebanon. No exotic bet. No leverage. Just banked money. Inside the official system. On the wrong side of the window. No success. That is the pattern for this entire film. Not who panicked. Who moved first? Stopped as requested. The official story says hyperinflation is a storm. Something that arrives. Something no one can really control. But the forensic record says something colder. It is signed, authorized, extended, rationalized. Thy name. Start in Germany. Before Weimar became a byword for collapse, the legal architecture was already there. In August 1914, Germany changed the banking laws so Reichsbank coverage could be padded with loan bureau paper that counted like reserve backing without being gold. The gold story stayed in place. The substance changed underneath it. And to keep that story alive, Karl Helfferich and Rudolf Havenstein pushed a patriotic campaign for the public to hand gold over to the Reichsbank. By the end of 1916, virtually no specie remained in circulation. The public held paper. The institution held the metal. That matters, because when the mark finally broke in earnest, most people were not choosing between paper and gold in real time. That choice had already been narrowed for them years earlier. Havenstein did not treat the printing press as the problem. In August 1922, he said stabilization was impossible until reparations were resolved. That is the key mental move. The administrator of the currency collapse does not describe the collapse as his own product. He describes it as an external necessity, and the numbers are brutal. By late 1923, a dollar bought trillions of paper marks. A loaf of bread that had cost around 160 marks at the end of 1922 reached the hundreds of billions in Berlin by late 1923. Debts vanished. Salaries died between payday and supper. The paper system did not fail all at once. It failed in layers, while officials kept speaking as if the frame still held. Now move to Zimbabwe. Gideon Gono's name is all over the administrative record. His mid-year monetary policy statement of October 1, 2007 is not a rumor. It is a formal central bank document issued under the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe Act. By early 2008, even secondary academic reconstruction using contemporary reporting records. Gono stating that money supply had reached $170 trillion on January 21, 2008, with expectations it would surge further. Then came the terminal phase. Steve Hanke and Alex Kwok's reconstruction put Zimbabwe's monthly inflation peak at 79.6 billion% in mid-November 2008. They also note the central bank stopped producing meaningful data for much of 2008, creating what they call a data void around the final collapse. Read that again. The institution printing the currency also controlled the visibility of the evidence. That is not weather. That is procedure. And here, the pattern sharpens. The public held wage money, local deposits, cash that decayed by the week. The governor administering the collapse was not forced to live inside that same shrinking instrument in the same way. On the specific question of what Gideon Gono personally held during the terminal phase foreign currency, gold, offshore assets, or domestic claims, the public record I can verify is incomplete, but the larger mechanism does not need that missing line item. In both Weimar and Zimbabwe, the people running the currency regime did not wake up one morning surprised by collapse. They managed the interval, and you paid for that interval if you stayed loyal to the paper. You look for selective mobility, who can still move claims out of the system while everyone else is told to wait, comply, and trust the process. Venezuela gives you the mechanism in crude form. In December 2013, Reuters reported that Venezuela's own interior minister said roughly 40% of the buyers receiving dollars to the official currency control system that year were shell companies. Billions were leaking through a gate that ordinary citizens were told existed to protect national stability. Then, in January 2014, Reuters reported a dual-rate overhaul that explicitly tried to curb embezzlement of oil dollars inside the control regime itself. The state was not just restricting access, it was rationing access through a structure already riddled with privileged extraction. And that is the detail people miss. Capital controls do not eliminate exit, they rank it. If you are close enough to the allocation mechanism, the control system becomes an asset. If you are not, it becomes a cage. U.S. people. Prosecutors later described a $1 billion bribery scheme tied to PDVSA officials and vendors, with conduct stretching back to 2011-2013, including priority treatment for invoices during PDVSA's liquidity stress. In other words, when dollars were scarce, access itself became monetized. Then comes the visible repositioning, not theory, property, jurisdiction, distance. In 2021, Reuters reported that a holder of defaulted Venezuelan bonds was considering an attempt to seize Florida's seafront apartments belonging to Raul Gorin, the media mogul accused by U.S. prosecutors of bribing Venezuelan officials to win contracts. That does not prove every Venezuelan elite family bought Miami real estate with crisis money. It does prove the form of escape, external claims, external courts, external property rights. The bolivar was for the population trapped inside the mechanism. The durable claim was elsewhere, now back to Beirut, because Lebanon is the cleaner case. Less ideological noise, more forensic clarity. When the bank shut the country out in late 2019, the rules were presented as emergency necessity. But later reporting showed the restrictions were not applied evenly. Reuters reported in March 2022 that while most savers could not access their own cash, a source with knowledge of the matter said some banks had transferred money for politicians and their allies. The Association of Banks in Lebanon did not confirm that allegation. But the allegation matters because it matches the structure of the crisis exactly. No formal capital control law, broad depositor paralysis, selective transfer capacity for the connected. That is the side door. Not everyone escapes, not even most elites, but enough do. Enough to prove that a collapsing financial regime does not close symmetrically. It closes socially, through proximity, through discretion, through undocumented exceptions. And if you are outside that circle, your bank balance is no longer money. It is Q position. The buried lead is not that the warnings were hidden, it is that they were public, just not public in the way you experienced the word, not on television. Not in branch language, not in the tone of the institutions asking for your trust. Take Lebanon again. On October 17, 2019, The IMF's Article 4 staff report stated that deposit inflows had slowed sharply. Bank de Lebanon foreign reserves had fallen by $7.5 billion from their earlier peak, and BDL should step back from quasi-fiscal operations and strengthen its balance sheet. The executive board summary repeated the same theme: rebuild BDL's financial strength and require banks to build more buffers. That is not a rumor. That is the public record. And yet, if you were a normal depositor in Beirut in October 2019, that document was not your reality. Your reality was the branch, the ATM, the manager's voice, the assumption that a peg still called a peg was still a peg. That is how institutional warnings work. They do not arrive in plain language. They arrive in technical phrasing that insiders are trained to hear. Buffer erosion, financial strength, quasi-fiscal operations, reserve declined. None of those phrases say, in ordinary speech, what they often mean in practice: the system is buying time. And Zimbabwe fits the same template from the other side. The IMF's later Article 4 assessments describe the eventual restoration of stability as depending on the halting of quasi-fiscal operations and monetary financing by the central bank. That matters because it tells you, in official language, what had previously helped destroy the currency regime. The warning is embedded in the cure, so when people say, "Nobody could have known," be careful. Nobody is not the right word. Plenty of institutional actors could know. They had the vocabulary, the incentives, and the habit of reading documents written for other institutions. What most depositors lacked was not intelligence. It was translation. No one converted the record into survival language before the window closed. That is the real asymmetry. Not access to information in the absolute sense. Access to interpretable information in time. Now bring the pattern into the present. Not to predict, to compare. Turkey is not Lebanon in 2019. It is not Weimar. It is not Zimbabwe. The institutions are different. The balance sheet structure is different, and the state still has policy room those regimes eventually lost. Say that clearly, or you stop being forensic and start performing. But the signal worth watching is familiar. Gold. The BDDK's banking data tracks precious metal deposit accounts in the banking system, which means you can see, in official form, when savers began migrating part of their balance sheet trust away from pure lira exposure. And by early 2026, Reuters reported that Turkish banks held about $80 billion in gold-based deposits, while the central bank held a similar amount in gold reserves and households, still held far more outside the banking system. That is not a fringe hedge. That is parallel savings behavior at national scale. Why does that matter? Because when people still work, still get paid, still use the domestic currency for daily life, but increasingly save in something else, you are looking at a split system. One money for transaction, another for memory, one for the month, another for the decade. That is never a neutral cultural curiosity. It is a trust map, and the state knows it. Reuters reported in February 2025 that Turkey's 2024 current account deficit narrowed sharply, helped in part by gold trade restrictions and tighter policy. That is a revealing detail. Authorities were not just fighting inflation in the abstract. They were managing the external consequences of domestic gold demand. So what does the forensic template suggest comes next? Not inevitable collapse. That would be lazy. It suggests that when a population increasingly saves in gold foreign currency or parallel instruments, official stabilization becomes more dependent on confidence management, reserve management, and the state's ability to keep domestic transaction money functioning while private long-term trust migrates elsewhere. If that migration accelerates, the gap widens between what the system says its money is and what people treat as durable wealth. And once that gap gets wide enough, policy stops being about prosperity. It becomes about containment. That is why Turkey matters here. Not because the ending is predetermined, because the sequence is legible. You watch where savings go before you watch what officials say. So here is the forensic conclusion. The gap itself is the asset class, not gold by itself, not dollars by themselves, not farmland, watches, canned food, or offshore accounts in the abstract. Those are downstream choices. The upstream advantage is earlier recognition. The usable edge is the interval between internal institutional awareness and public behavioral change. In Lebanon, that interval separated trapped depositors from those who still had transfer capacity before the banks hardened into selective paralysis. In Weimar and Zimbabwe, it separated the administrators of the paper regime from the population still forced to live inside it. In Turkey, the current signal is not apocalypse. It is observable migration in savings behavior toward precious metals and away from pure faith and domestic money. And here's the caveat. Reading the record early does not give you certainty. It does not tell you the exact month a system breaks. It does not spare you from political risk, legal restrictions, confiscation risk, or the possibility that a fragile system stabilizes longer than you expect. Forensic reading is not prophecy. It is survival triage, so the practical lesson is narrower than most people want. Read Article 4 consultations. Read central bank balance sheet language. Read reserve trends. Read bank liquidity warnings. Watch what claims become harder to move. Watch what the connected class is quietly converting into something else, because by the time the official story changes, the best exits are usually gone. That is the binary choice. Learn to read the documents, or remain a depositor in someone else's collapse.